Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I want to follow up a little bit on the last video that I made where I was discussing my game development workflow, and today I want to take that a little bit further, maybe one step further, to talk about what we do after we finish actually creating our game. So now we have a workflow that we can use for developing our game from beginning to end, but then once we complete our game, what's the next step? Well, you might think that the next step logically would be to create our next game. So we might have an idea for another game that we want to create, and we would just naturally go ahead and use our workflow to create our next game. And that is one option, but it's not our only option, and it might not even be our best option. So at least for me, what I would like to do is actually get the most out of the games that I create. And although I've finished one game and it's maybe not the most impressive game, maybe it's not the most fancy game available, and it's not particularly impressive in the fact that it doesn't take advantage of the ZX Spectrum Next advanced features and capabilities, but it is a complete game, it's a working game, and it's playable, and it's finished. So what would be the next step for me after I have a working game? So the game that I've completed is, as you know if you watched my last video, it's a game called Bricks, which is a version of a breakout style game, and I've uploaded a version of this game to my itch.io account, and I've also uploaded it to the Spriteworks Facebook group for my Patreon subscribers. And this is a version of the game that's really not really a complete version of the game. It's more of a playable concept version of the game, and I'm going to discuss what I mean by that in a moment. But what I want to talk about in today's video is how we can actually get the most out of our games before we go ahead and start designing our next game. So once we have a game that's finished and complete and is working and playable, and we've put it out there, whatever version of the game that may be, it may be just a sample game with maybe only one level, or it may be a little more in-depth version of our game. I want to take a look at the options that we have available to us to get the most out of that game. So if that sounds interesting to you and you want to see what options you have available for your game development journey, then stick around and we'll take a look at it right now. Alright, so if you take a look at my itch.io account page here I am on the Spriteworks page for itch.io, where I've uploaded the initial version of my game for free download. And this isn't, like I said, a very impressive game. It's just a quick basic game that I put together to demonstrate my game development workflow. And it was effective for that, I think, because within a couple of weeks I had this entire game designed and programmed and developed, and now it has gone from being an idea in my head to an actual complete and playable working game on this website. So if you want to check it out, feel free to head over to itch.io and download it if you like. And here we can see the image of the screen, and I'll just go to the page for this game. And here I've got some details about the game that I've included, or this demo version of the game which I've included. And this isn't actually what I'm considering a demo version of this game, because it's just one level of a kind of a pre-release version of the game. So it's not a very complete game, it's not a very in-depth game. So I'm calling this actually a concept version of the game. So if I go back to the title here on the main page, you can see I'm calling it Bricks Concept Version for the ZX Spectrum Next. And what I mean by concept version is it's not really a representative version of the full version of this game, because it's missing a lot of features that would be required to be an actual full version of this game. And I'll get into that more in a moment. So for now, let's go ahead and just click on this picture, and we'll go to the main screen for this game here, where I've got some features listed and some screenshots. And so this is all part of the development process. You want to make your game available for people to download and play and try it out and enjoy. And even if it's not a very impressive game by your standards, even if it's just a very simple game, as long as it's playable and it's complete and it's not full of bugs, and you actually think it's somewhat fun to play, which I think this game is, then you might as well upload it somewhere for people to try it out, which is what I've done in this case. I've uploaded this concept version of my game to my itch.io account, and people can download it and try it out. And if I click on the sample video here, and I'll just zoom it in a bit, we can actually see the gameplay for this game. And it's a very simple game. It's just, like I said, a basic game, and it displays a bunch of bricks on the screen, and you control the paddle going back and forth to knock the bricks out of the screen. And there's a bonus score feature, and it's playable, and it works, and it's finished. So now let's go back and take a look at where can I go from here now that I have this concept version of my game uploaded for people to try out. So if we take a look now, I've got a list on my screen of some different versions of the game that I'm calling Lifecycle of the game. People might think that the normal way to do things is to come up with an idea for a game and create that game, and then once it's done, hopefully it actually gets done, which is the purpose of having a workflow, as we discussed in my last video. But then after that, the next step is not always to create a brand new game, but we want to, like I said, try and make the most of the game that we've already created, because we put a lot of thought and effort and time into that game, creating it and debugging it and getting it working. And if people like our game and they download it, they may be interested in seeing more of it. They may be interested in having a more complete version or a different version, and that's what we're going to look at today. So let's first of all take a look at the different versions of the games that I'm considering making in my game development journey. And of course, I'm just starting out with this simple example of a game, but ideally I'm going to be creating more in-depth versions of games that are more impressive once I increase my skill level and my experience for creating games for the ZX Spectrum next. But if we take a look at my screen here, let's take a look at some different versions that we might use for our games. So you can see the first one here I'm calling Proof of Concept right here, which is the version of the game that I've uploaded to my itch.io account, which I've made freely available for people to download for free. And the reason it's free is because it's such a simple, limited game that I don't really feel right charging anyone money for it. In later versions of my games, though, I will charge for it. And some people make their games available for free. Other people charge for them. But for me, I make my videos available for free. And the proof of concept and demo versions of my games are available for free. So let's take a look at some of the different versions that I'll be considering in my games. So the first one, which is the proof of concept, I've already completed and uploaded to itch.io. And you can see here my description of it. I put a very limited playable version to validate the concept. So this proof of concept version of the game is what I'm considering a workable, playable version of the game, but extremely limited. It's mainly to test out the game mechanics, to get an idea if we actually like the game, if we think the game is worthwhile to develop further. In this case, I think it is worthwhile. I find it to be a somewhat fun game to play, and I think it might be worthwhile having a more complete version of this game. So the next version I have listed here is called Demo Version. And what's a demo version of the game? Well, if we take a look at the next section here where I've listed full version, obviously a full version of the game would be a more complete, more comprehensive version of the game. In this case, it would have obviously more levels and maybe more features and some enhancements perhaps. So the full version of the game would be just that. It would be a full version of the game that's playable and we think is actually comprehensive enough to be considered a full version of an actual playable game. So then a demo version of that game would be a limited version of that game, which would be released, in my case, for free, because we want people, well, I want people to be able to experience my games for free before paying any money for them so they can see what it's like. We spend a lot of time and effort creating our games, and we may want to charge at least a small amount of money for them. But I think it's worthwhile to have a demo version of my games so people can try it out before they buy it. So if we take a look at the details I've listed here for the demo version of my game, it says limited version of the full game, and it says it may be limited in number of levels and or features, but not too limited because it should provide an accurate game experience. So the full version of the game obviously contains all of the features and functionality that we want in our complete game, but the demo version of the game, I like it to include most of the features that would really give the player a sense of what it's like to play the full version. However, it needs to be limited in some way to motivate the player to actually purchase the full version, even if it's just a small amount of money for a very simple game. I think this is a worthwhile path to follow in releasing a game, to have different versions, and we'll discuss why a bit more later in what the different versions can offer to people. So let's take a look at this one now and talk about the demo version a bit more. So the demo version of a game should be complete and playable in that it contains most of the essential features. Now in this case, for this bricks game, for example, the way I would limit it would be obviously in the number of levels. So there wouldn't be as many levels to play in the demo version, but that doesn't detract from the actual features. But the features that I do want to limit would be things that wouldn't really make a huge difference to the player who's just trying it out. So for example, maybe in this case, my full version of the game would have support for joysticks, and whereas the demo version might only support the keyboard. So things like that. You can still get a good feeling for the demo version of the game without having necessarily all of the features in place. And then finally down here you can see I've listed a deluxe version, which would be a more enhanced version of the game. You can see it says full version with enhancements, which could be enhanced elements, and the elements are things like graphics and sounds, and it may have new features, and it may have extra levels and different enhancements and different features that would make it a deluxe version. So these are some examples of different versions of our games that we might want to create. And now I'll scroll down a bit and we'll take a look at another list here, which is game evolution. So now that we've got our initial game created, let's say we have a demo version of our game completed, which means we're also going to be having a full version of our game either already completed or being released at some point, because there's no point having a demo version of the game if you don't have a full version of the game for people to download later on. So here I have a list showing some different versions of the game as well. And now let me explain what this list is showing us. So what I want to do here is to demonstrate how we can use an existing game to actually get the most of it and see where we can go next in our game development journey. So let's say, for example, we have a demo version of our game completed right here that says very limited playable version to validate the concept. So we have a demo version of the game that people can try out and see if they like it or not. And here I have a column called implementation difficulty. So that would be, I'm calling it normal difficulty because whatever effort it takes to actually create the demo version, that's the difficulty that it requires based on how complex our game is. And again, you don't need to create a demo version if you don't want to. You can just go ahead and create the full version of your game and release it like that. But in my case, I will be releasing demo versions because I want to differentiate the free version that people can try out without paying any money, and then having a separate full version that will have a charge associated with it, which would be right here, the full version of the game, which it says here is a full featured version. So that's pretty self-explanatory. And again, the difficulty level to implement a full version of the game is just whatever effort it takes to create a full version of the game. So probably in all cases, we're going to at least be creating a full version of our game. That's our goal, is to have a workable, playable game. So if you like, you can start with a demo version, or you can go ahead and just create the full version. It's up to you. So now let's say we have a game completed and we want to see what we should do next. So let's say we already have a full version of our game created, and we may or may not have created a demo version. I think it's a good idea, but again, it's up to you. So let's see what else we can do after we have our initial game created. So here, the next step you can see I've listed as extra levels. And these different steps are indicated in order of their difficulty of implementation. So you see here on the right side, I put easy, and extra levels means, according to the description, additional levels similar to the existing ones. So for example, in my bricks game, I could easily create extra levels for my game simply by designing more patterns of bricks. And it's very easy to implement extra levels because all the functionality of the game is already in place. So in this case, it would probably make sense for me to release some different versions of the game that have different levels, because it would be quite easy for me to do that, and that would provide value for the players to have extra levels that they can play. So that is one easy way we can get more functionality and more use out of our existing game, is simply by creating extra levels, and all the rest of the game mechanics would be the same. And then my next option here is called reskin. So what is reskin? Well, you're probably already familiar with this term for online games and mobile games and such, where a reskin would be basically the same game but with a different look to it. So maybe it's different graphics, different game assets like sound effects, music. So it's basically a change of the way the game looks and sounds. And that's normally quite simple to implement as well. Maybe not as simple as adding extra levels, depending how involved it is to add extra levels to your game. In my case, it's quite simple because I just need to design some extra brick patterns and play around with them to see how I like them. But redesigning the game in terms of giving it a different skin, a different look and sound to it with different graphics and different sound effects and different music perhaps, that could be fairly easy to implement as well. And so I've listed that as easy, and that's an option we could do as well. And the next option I have listed here is called sequel or deluxe version. So a sequel to our game is something that we might want to implement. It's a little more involved than just simply reskinning the game or creating some extra levels. And if we take a look at my notes here, it says same engine with new features, with some assets may be reusable. So I'm sure you already know the game engine is the main core programming of the game that provides all the game mechanics and it allows the game to operate. So the game engine is usually what takes the most effort in actually programming the game. So once we have that game engine created, it makes sense to try and make the most of it by offering different versions of our game that use the same engine. So in this case, a sequel, which could be a totally different version of the game in terms of features that it offers, but it would use the same game engine. And some of the assets may also be reusable. We may be able to reuse some of the graphics or sound effects or music as well. But since the game engine is not changing, it's not a huge investment of extra time and effort to create a sequel necessarily or a deluxe version. It's up to you if you want to make it a sequel that's somewhat different from the original version, or if you want to call it a deluxe version because it's quite similar to the original version. And in this case, this would take probably a medium effort to implement because although it is reusing the same engine, it will have new features. And features obviously take some programming effort, which would require debugging and a bit of thought and effort to go into it because we have to actually figure out how to implement these new features, right? So that is our next option available to us, is to create a sequel. And a lot of times we might even have a sequel in mind when we're creating our first version of the game. If you remember, we took a look at in my last video the core or critical features that we want to have included in our original version of the game, and then we listed some optional features we might want to include at a later point. Well, these optional features would be good features to consider for a sequel, for example. Now let's take a look at my next option here, which I'm calling spin-off. So what do I mean by spin-off? A spin-off, as I'm describing it, would have these characteristics here. It would be a new game in the same genre. So when we're talking about genre, I'm sure you know a genre would be the type of game that we're talking about. And some examples of genre would be maybe a scrolling shooter game, or a platformer game, or a dungeon crawler, or a text adventure, or a graphical adventure, or a puzzle game. Whatever main theme the game follows, what type of game it is, that is the genre. And so if we're creating a spin-off to our game, it would be a different game but in the same genre. So let's say we're creating a platform game, which hopefully we're not all creating platform games because there's already a ton of platform games and it might be nice to see something a little different. So maybe our original game is a scrolling shooter that's a side-scrolling shooter, so it scrolls from left to right, and we have maybe a spaceship that's shooting objects from left to right in our side-scrolling shooter, and we finished our game and it's full and complete, but now we want to make another game in the same genre. So we might want to create a similar game that is in the same genre, but maybe it's a vertical scrolling shooter or a different type of scrolling shooter that has some new features and assets as I've listed here, and also it would have a similar engine. So in this case, a spin-off, since it has a similar engine, it might not be the exact same engine because the mechanics of the game might be somewhat different, but since it is the same genre and the overall type of game is the same, it might not take that much effort to redesign the engine for our new game. And we would also be having new features and assets, so it will have a different look to it, a different sound to it, and it would have different features, and that all takes effort. So in this case, I've listed this as a medium effort. So it's still in the same genre, but it's essentially a brand new game. And then finally at the bottom here, I've listed new. So this is the point I was talking about at the beginning of this video, where we might be tempted to come up with a new idea for a brand new game, and we start working on this new game, and we just leave the old game alone and we never go back to it, I think that's kind of a waste because, like I said, we put a lot of effort into making that first game. And if there's any interest at all in our first game and we think it's worth expanding on a little bit, then I think it's worthwhile to at least consider looking at some of these other options for creating sequels or extra levels or enhanced versions of our original game before we actually go and start working on our next completely different game. And a completely different game I would consider as being in a different genre, for example. For example, if our first game is a side-scrolling shooter and our second game is a text adventure, those are obviously two completely different games. They require two completely different game engines, different coding, different graphics, different elements, different features. They're completely different. So we're basically starting a new game from the ground up. So it will have a new engine, new features, and new assets. Everything is completely new. And this is obviously the most difficult, the most time-consuming to implement because, again, we're starting from the ground up, from scratch. But these are all options that are available to us when we are making our games. Now, there's one more thing I want to discuss, which is, if I scroll down here, ongoing game dev activities. So now let's say we're creating games and developing games, and we want to think about, okay, well, now we have an idea how to actually create a game from beginning to end, from start to finish, and actually get it done and completed using our game development workflow. And now we also have an idea of how we can expand on or get the most use out of our original game by creating other versions of it with extra levels or sequels and so forth. But now let's talk about what should we actually be doing, or what could we be doing when we're doing our game development activities. What exactly should we work on? What should we be thinking about? And how can we actually approach doing our game development activities in an ongoing manner over the long term in a way that's sustainable and still enjoyable, and that allows us to move forward in our game development journey? Well, there are a few different aspects here that I've defined that I think I'm going to be focusing on in my game development journey, even though I've only just started making very simple, basic games. Obviously, that's not my goal. I want to continue my journey to make more and more advanced games, more impressive games, more fun games, right? So how do I do that? Well, I've got 3 different sections listed here, and the first thing is the activity. What do I want to focus on in my activities on an ongoing basis? Well, there are 3 different activities I have listed here. One is called skills and tools, one is called existing games, and one is called new games. So these are the 3 main areas that I plan to focus my effort on as I go forward in my game development journey. So the first section I have listed here is skills and tools. So what does that mean? Well, in my case, skills and tools means I want to be continuously improving my skills, improving my experience, gaining more knowledge and skills for doing actual programming and technical aspects of creating a game. And this could be coding techniques, learning more advanced features of the programming language, for example. Or this could be asset generation, learning how to create better sound, better graphics, better music. It could be a more efficient workflow. I could continue developing my workflow process and make it more efficient and make it even work better for me in creating my games. And finally, I have listed here better development environment. So we might come up with a better way of creating our games using a different development environment, which might even include looking at different programming languages. For example, we might start off creating basic games, and then we might go into creating Boreal basic games, which are compilable basic games. And then we might move into assembly language, perhaps creating basic games with some portions of machine code included, or maybe switching completely to creating our games entirely in Z80 assembly language. So I want to continue improving my skills, both in coding and creating the assets, and also developing my workflow, and maybe even improving the game development environment. And here I've listed timeline as continuous, which means this is an ongoing effort that I should be continuously doing on an ongoing basis. I want to continuously learn more advanced techniques and just improve my game development method and workflow and techniques. So let's see what my next section here, which is existing games. Now this is what we just discussed, looking at our existing games and figuring out how we can get the most out of them by creating sequels and more levels to them and different versions of them. So this is something that we can keep in mind when we're going forward in creating games, is always taking a look at our existing games and seeing what more we can do with them. And this could include such things as level packs, sequels, spin-offs, as we discussed before. And if you take a look at the timeline here, it says independent or cycle with new games. So the new games would be obviously creating brand new games from scratch, which, as we know, takes the most amount of effort. So one way we might want to approach this is perhaps we've created an existing game, and as we're learning new techniques, we might want to enhance our existing games, and maybe we want to go back and forth between working on our existing games, creating new levels and new enhancements and new versions, and working on brand new games. And what I mean by independent or cycle with new games, or in this case, independent or cycle with existing games, what this means is, for example, let's say we have an existing game and now we decide to make an expansion pack to it. We want to make another version of the game that has more levels, for example, which is what I'll be doing with my bricks game. So in this case, I could either do that independently, and I just set aside some time and I work on making my new version of the game with a new set of levels, and I do that until it's completed, and then I maybe go on to starting a brand new game. Or what I might want to do is maybe I have an idea for a new game and I might start working on the new game, but then maybe I get a little bit burnt out working on the new game. I need to give my brain a rest and do something that's a bit easier and maybe more relaxing for my brain. So then maybe I want to take a break from my new game and go back and maybe work on some new levels for an existing game. We can take a look at our existing games and see what more we can do with them, which games we think might be worthwhile to invest some more effort on and release some more versions of those old games, or maybe they're not really that popular and we're not really that interested in them anymore, and then we can just leave them as is and focus our efforts on some of our other existing games, or maybe start creating some brand new games. So now let me just give you a little preview of what I plan to do in expanding my existing bricks game, just to go through this process and get a feel for how it can work in expanding my existing game while thinking about creating some new games. So let me go back to my bricks page here, and here I'll just share with you how I'm doing it for my games. And if you take a look here, this is the overview that we covered in our last video, where we discussed the description of the game and the different features that the game will have. So here you can see now I've listed it as concept version, which is the version I've uploaded to itch.io right now, the simple basic one level version. Well, actually it's infinite levels because the same level keeps getting generated over and over again with random placement of the special bricks. And I've got listed here the different features that are included in my concept version. And if I scroll down, you can see I have another version called demo version, which is going to be a demo version of a more full version of this game I plan to create. And I've got different features listed for that. And then if I keep scrolling down, I've got full game version features, which means this is the full playable version of my game, which is what the demo version is based on. The demo version is a limited version of the full version. And then I had some kind of interesting ideas for expansion packs or different versions of this game that I could make. For example, here I have a version called Invaders Level Pack, which is, I thought it would be kind of cool to create a version of the game that has brick patterns that are arranged in the pattern of Space Invaders enemies. So they would look something like this, and all the bricks would be arranged in these patterns. And then I have ideas for other types of level packs that I could release kind of on an ongoing basis. For example, I have one here called Geometrica Level Pack, which is going to be the bricks arranged in geometric shapes, and this one called Lost in the Maze Level Pack, where I would be using indestructible bricks to form the pattern for a maze where the ball has to actually find its way through the maze in order to knock out the bricks that are contained within the maze. And so there are different versions of this game that I plan to release, even though, like I said, it's a very simple game, but I still think it's worthwhile to go through this exercise to create new versions of this existing game to try and get the most use out of it, and also to provide more value for our players and let them have more fun with a game they might already enjoy. So I record these videos a bit in advance of when I actually publish them, so I'm not sure which of these versions of the game will actually be available by the time this video gets published, but all of the versions of my game I upload to the Spriteworks private Facebook group for my Patreon subscribers. So any of my Patreon subscribers who are at a level that has access to the Spriteworks Facebook group can go ahead and download all the versions of my games for free. Otherwise, they'll be listed on the itch.io account for anyone to download the free samples, or they can download the paid versions if they like. So feel free to go ahead and check them out, and hopefully you have some fun playing them. And if you have any suggestions or ideas or feedback on any of my games, feel free to leave me a comment either down below this video or on my Spriteworks itch.io account page as well, and I'll check them out. So there I've given you some ideas of how we can go about getting the most out of our existing games and look at creating some new games. And for me, the whole point of this is to try and provide as much enjoyment as I can for the people who play my games, giving them some variety, which means expanding on my existing games, while also thinking of some ideas for some new games I might like to create. So hopefully you found this video enjoyable, and maybe it's given you some ideas of how you can progress in your game development journey and how you can make the most of your existing games, and also think about some new games that we can also look forward to enjoying from you. So that's all for now. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.